Welcome to the Linen Suit and Plastic Tie Podcast. This is the podcast where we dissect, analyze, investigate the amazing, the stupendous, the epic, the cool, the spectacular power of storytelling and learn how to harness that power to supercharge our everyday lives. I'm Gaurav.
And I'm Kevin.
Kev, you know something I've been noticing through these intros? I keep saying suspendus. Is that a word? Because I say it a lot in these intros and I keep meaning to stop and I don't know why I say it. I start the word. I'm thinking about a word like stupendous, I think maybe I'm trying to say. And I start it, then I don't know where I'm going and I just finish the word and I move on. But I've been saying suspendus or like stupendous. One, is that a word? Two, why do we keep letting that go in the intro? And three, is it a word that's applicable to it?
Well, neither was Excelsior a word.
Okay. Excelsior is Stan Lee's catchphrase. And as you know, Stan Lee is one of my storytelling idols. And that is a nod to him every time.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Excelsior wasn't a word, but now it is. And then think different, which is one of Apple's most famous marketing slogan, was a grammar error, but it sticks. So maybe
I feel like suspendus is me just like a nod to suspenders almost, but suspendus is not a word. Stupendous is, and that means extremely impressive. And I think that's what I've been trying to say. So it's awesome. Move on.
Maybe it will be a word by season 5.
Anyways, Kev, this is one of the first few episodes back for season 3. In between season 2, season 3, we took a little bit of longer break. We were dealing with life issues. You caught the COVID bug. And we, of course, took our usual recharge break as we figured out our lives and figured out what season 3 was going to look like and reset a bit. During that time, we took our yearly trip to Florida, you, me, and a couple of our friends. And something we've been trying to do during these trips is taking some time to sit, relax, and read books. It's December 9th, 8th, whatever. We're in LAX. We go to Book Soup and we're exploring books. I pick up a book even though I still haven't opened it, and I spent my break finishing Guy Raz's Amazing How I Built This Book, which is a book based on his podcast. And it was really cool because I got to see how these episodes of his podcast tied together, how he pulled out key themes and made them chapters. It made me think about our show, about how every episode's so unique, a unique story, a unique lens on storytelling. And what Guy Raz did for entrepreneurship is he took those similar themes and then tied them to individual episodes. So it's kind of like a deconstruction of his pod, going back, looking at high level, and then bringing his pod back in. I thought that was really cool and made me think about our pod a lot because you can do the same thing. Anyways, that's what I picked up. That was the book I recently finished, and I have so many other books I need to read. But Kev, what book did you pick up?
Well, I picked up this book Gaurav recommended called Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow. It is a novel. It's a fictional story of best friends creating video games together. And I honestly cannot recommend it enough because it's such a great story and such fantastic storytelling techniques involved in that book. But what it really inspired me with is some of its insights, particularly about the action of playing together, not just video games, but playing in general. And if you think about it, playing is some of the most intimate things we can do with one another. It's one of the most important ways we interact as human beings. So, that's been really interesting. And luckily enough for this season, we are bringing on an expert storyteller in the field of gaming. So for this episode, we are talking to Joshua Liu. He is right now an investing partner at Games Fund One, which is a VC at the very famous venture capital a16z. He has also personally worked on a lot of games, social media games in particular. He has served product management and leadership roles at companies like Meta, Blizzard, Zynga. So we're really excited to be able to talk to someone like this about storytelling within gaming and the storytelling element of playing. So let's get into it. Very nice to have you here with us, Josh. And to start us off, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? What is your story?
Thanks for having me on. My story starts a long time ago. I got into the games industry because I was a hardcore gamer. This is not unique to the games industry, but it is a little unique to my story. So I grew up with three younger brothers. We all had like terrible allergies, and so didn't go outside a whole bunch, and so stayed inside primarily playing video games with each other. And I grew up as a competitive Tetris player, as a competitive Mario Kart Double Dash speedrunner, as a competitive MMO guild leader and theory crafter, as a competitive Halo 3 player. And so I poured basically my life into games for most of my sort of childhood. I went to school thinking that I'd either go into finance or law. And when I came out of school, neither of those things felt inspiring to me still. And so I began to look for a job. And when I was interviewing at different places like, Google and Samsung, I met a whole bunch of people who were like way smarter than me. And so when it came time to decide on, one of several job offers, I ended up choosing to go into the games industry, largely because I thought that that was the only place in the world where I didn't have to be the smartest person in the room to like do well. I just had to know and love the product, better than most. And games was the place that helped me do that. Interestingly, the games company that I joined was not a hardcore games company. It was a company called Playdom. We were making like MySpace and Facebook games at the time. And the first game that I worked on was a game called Social City, which is like it's like think Sim City, but on Facebook. Very cartoony, made for the masses. And so I was making games that I normally wouldn't have played, maybe like, growing up as a competitive gamer, but, fell in love with the game anyway, and fell in love with the fact that like millions, tens of millions of people, fell in love with the game too. And then I was hooked. And so I've stayed in the games industry ever since. I've worked at a whole bunch of different awesome games companies, making games. And now I'm an investor at Andreessen Horowitz, where for the first time, I'm not making games anymore, but I'm actually, getting to invest in other people making games, supporting the games industry that way.
I think you bring up something really important that we talked to a lot of our guests about in the idea of like working in your passions. Is that, of course, it's a very obvious like advice: do what you're passionate about. But I think there's such a tactical thing about it that gets overlooked. Where even if in the beginning, because in the beginning you're not doing like the dream job, like you're doing the grunt work, you're getting in there, you're building things, you're building games you don't usually play. But because you're in an industry you're passionate about, it's what you're reading about, it's what you're hearing about, it's what you're talking to your friends about. And instead of being in another industry where that's a lot of external research you have to do, it's stuff you're generally already doing. And I was recently interviewing in a lot of places, going through the job hunt, and I noticed the interviews that was the most seamless was the stuff, not the stuff I had done the research for before the interview, but the stuff I had been talking about for years and kind of flowing in. So I think it's a little bit of an obvious point, but we love kind of pointing that out because from a very tactical level, when you apply and interview and work at companies you're passionate about, even if it's in a role you're not that's new or different or not the dream role, you are talking and having these conversations about things because you're passionate about it. So I love that as a kind of a career trajectory.
I think that's totally right. It's not just what you're passionate about and what you're thinking about. It's like it's authenticity, right? Like, at the end of the day, somebody who researches the thing that you're passionate about can sort of talk about the same things in a smart way. Something that I think about a lot is, there's this like pop science thing where to become a master of something, you can sort of like get there by spending 10,000 hours, like, learning it. Well, 10,000 hours is a lot, and not every hour is created equal. And so when you're passionate about something, your hour spent doing a thing is just much more efficacious than somebody else doing an hour of a thing. And so your 10,000 hours may actually be like 3 or 4 times higher quality, or you can get to the same mastery level of something in way less time. And so there are real practical benefits too of, really loving a thing and like, going down the rabbit hole of something you care about.
Absolutely. And I think jumping a little bit ahead in your career to Andreessen Horowitz, I think something interesting about that historic VC firm is that it's not like some of the other VC firms where to know, rattle off a list, you have to kind of be in the industry. Andreessen Horowitz kind of explodes outside of just the VC firm where many people know it. And many of the VCs like yourself have become thought leaders in the industry through things like Twitter and Medium and podcasts and what have you. How has that adjustment been for you, moving from just being like a game builder to more of a thought leader in the industry where people turn to for what's happening, trends, things like that?
To be totally candid, I'm still getting used to it. It is like it's like a deeply uncomfortable thing to, for you to be thought as a thought leader, because the pressure is high for you to sort of like, have thoughts that aren't dumb and net incremental to the industry. I think the reason I'm so sensitive to this comes from my own experience from the games industry. When I got my start, I was making MySpace and Facebook games. And then I went to mobile games, and then I did instant messaging games, and then I did VR games, and then I did back to mobile games, then I did cross-platform games, then I did sort of like VR at Meta. And the point is, all along the way, I have literally watched as the industry has changed completely, like many times over. And so the reality is, you become a dinosaur in this industry really, really quickly, especially if you're not in it all of the time on the front lines, learning and like working. And so, it's something that I'm sensitive to because, I think that the industry is moving really quickly. It's what makes it so fun, but it's also, I think, what makes it really difficult to be a thought leader is, in the fact that things are changing so quickly. And so, whatever you say may totally be right for a time. And, you may look back on it in a couple of years and go, well, what the hell was I thinking? Because, that's just sort of how, capricious the industry can be sometimes.
You've described the different types of game you played growing up and also the games you have worked on. I think one common theme across all of these different games is that it has a very strong kind of social network theme. That's kind of a very particular genre across all the video games that are out there. So could you maybe tell us a little bit about how this social media type of genre is unique as a game and also as kind of a storytelling platform?
Yeah, maybe there's two components to that. There's like social media games that like exist on social media platforms. And then there's like social games that sort of like are centered around social interactions, relationships, cooperation, competition. To start at like a very high level, something that is important to know about games is, games have always intrinsically been social. Like people play games with each other, and like that's sort of like why games are fun, right? Like I always talk about checkers. Like checkers has been mathematically solved for a really long time. So is tic-tac-toe. I mean, tic-tac-toe is like hilariously easily solved, and yet people still play year after year, decade after decade. Why? Because there's somebody you're playing with, and like there's asymmetry of information, and you can talk crap and like poke fun at each other. And so ultimately, like games are fun for a very, very long time, not because of the game mechanic, although there are like these game mechanics that have survived millennia, chess being a really good example, but because of the people, the social component of it, right? Like games are ultra successful when the people become an extension of the content rather than the content itself. And so all of this is a very long-winded way of saying in my observation, the very best games ever, as measured by anything you want, have always been intrinsically social. And those are the types of games that I like to play and that I like to build and I want to fund. So that's like maybe on a little bit on like the social, just like social games. And then like, the games that are on social networks sort of like benefit from this like inbuilt people liquidity. So when you play a game on Facebook, back when Facebook platform had a bunch of games on it, and Facebook still allowed games to sort of like feature heavily in the platform, you had people playing games for the first time, and maybe they were playing largely a single player game, but by virtue of looking at their feed and seeing that all of their friends were also playing the same game, you then felt like you were part of this living, breathing, larger organism that was bigger than you. And so, even when the game mechanic itself was not intrinsically social, it still felt social because you could talk to your friends about it. They were sending you random cows or whatever. And like, you felt close to them. When I was working on Words with Friends, we would ask our users all of the time, well, like, what is one of the main reasons you play Words with Friends? And like, the top answer was always super obvious, like, I want to learn how to have a better vocabulary and spell better. Fine. But the number two reason, and the thing that was always interesting to me was, oh, I use Words with Friends to like keep in touch with people. And specifically, it was to keep in touch with people in like this layer right above a Facebook poke, but below like a phone call. So like, we used to get people talk to us all the time and say, "Oh yeah, I play Words with Friends with my grandma, who like I don't really want to call because then she'll talk my ear off for an hour, but like probably deserves more than a postcard from me. And so like I'll play my turn on Words with Friends, say hello, and like I'll do that once a day, and like then I'll feel good about myself. My grandma feels good, and like, but it's also a very low risk situation. That's sort of the benefit of these games on social networks is you, by virtue of being in a network, a platform with a network, you're already immediately closer to all these people. It becomes really, really easy to play a game with them, even if it's super light touch. And human beings just love communicating that way.
Such an interesting angle. And what that does also is it allows people to create stories with each other. As a result of that connection, you can say that, for your grandmother or friends who you don't necessarily talk as often, it's a shared memory that you can have that, okay, we play this game together. And I think from there, what's unique about gaming as a storytelling medium?
Well, I think there are a couple of things. One, games are interactive and immersive. And by virtue of playing with somebody else, where like, the game sort of changes all of the time, it's a story that is, part pick your own adventure, part sort of like, campfire story being told by multiple people. It can have a different ending every single time. And like, you have some agency. And it's immersive, right? Like, in many games, you're sort of like exploring a world built by somebody else, either by yourself or with other people. And so there's this also like this third party, like developer part of the story that you're experiencing. And then there's like the relationship part of the story. So even outside of the game, you're building the story of me, like my identity within the game. You're also building the story of us with your friends. World of Warcraft, as an example, the content of World of Warcraft is largely, I mean, look, they release new content all of the time or whatever, but the reason people play after 15 years or whatever is because they have this feeling of reciprocity with their friends. People that are in guilds with each other have never met in real life, and yet have inside jokes, call each other nicknames, and like know each other and how they make decisions or whatever in ways that like sometimes people even very close to them in real life wouldn't know. And so the power of the story of us is also really, really important in games. And so, again, games that do a good job of allowing people to build the story of me and the story of us in the context of the game are like, fantastic storytelling machines.
I think that's so interesting, and exactly one of the biggest reasons we've been dying to talk to some gamer people is because these essential stories of community are really huge in the gaming industry. Because not only are you entering someone else's story, building up your own story in the game, whether it's what you wear or the challenges you complete or the people you talk to, but you have community stories with the people you play with or the people you've met online, and it's such an immersive vision of community. And you see so many different industries trying to encapsulate that kind of excitement as they build IP. And one thing I've been thinking about a lot recently is, one of these biggest reasons comic book movies have blown up is because for decades they spent all this time developing these characters and testing things and trying things in these comic books. I'm a big comic book fan, so you think about like the 80 years of history with Spider-Man and how they tried things and saw what worked and didn't and played around. And there's a lot of weird Spider-Man stories that won't make the film, but the iconic ones do. We're seeing a lot of these studios take stabs at gaming films with like Dungeons and Dragons, Super Mario Bros, things like that. What do you think about that? Do you think gaming IP lends well into other arenas like film?
Yeah, I totally think it does. Let me take one step back and talk about one more thing, and then we'll answer your question. Like the incredibly powerful thing about games, uh, outside of just the social part, is it allows you to tell you a story about yourself, and like so you can pick a game and play in a way that tells you the story about yourself that like maybe isn't possible in real life. It's why like in lots of games like you're this like super powerful hero and only get more powerful and ridiculous over time. But what's also cool is like there are actually lots of games now where the goal isn't to like go and slay and kill and conquer and pillage or whatever. Like the goal is to make peace or be a good leader or generate lots of friends. There are games with special achievements where like that you can only unlock if you actually don't kill anything in the entire game. And so this is like maybe just like a quick detour. The power of telling a story of me that's like super flexible is awesome in games. And then this is also why I think games have in the past maybe have had a harder time crossing over into linear media, because in a comic book you have character development that's like on rails, right? Like it means the same largely to everyone because there's one story, and then like you can build content around that because the core is really stable. In games, because you're telling a different story of me and it means something different to everybody, it's why games are so powerful. But I actually think that now you're starting to see games reach a point of fidelity and world building where the scale of the game is so massive that even the story of me that somebody wants to tell, even if it's different, still isn't enough to sort of like meaningfully warp I think the world building that's going on. So when you see like The Last of Us released, they did a really great job at staying true to the story. There are multiple characters in that game, and so you can pick your own sort of like hero to associate with. But also, The Last of Us as a video game series now has enough world building over many years where there's actually a solid foundation to make a really great linear story out of it. And so you're starting to see that, and I'm really excited to see where that goes. And I'm also really excited to see other video game franchises do the same thing. You now have lots of video game franchises that have a whole bunch of literally decades, in some cases, of story building, world building, character development attached to them that would make for amazing linear media.
I think you make a really interesting point about this idea of shared stories with these games, because I didn't really think about that, how unique certain gaming experiences have been for different people. So building that foundation and building that history where there's a shared language makes that built-in audience so much stronger than it has been in the past. And you can see more parallels with like the comic book industry where yes, there's so many different versions of different characters, but there are essential storylines. Like Spider-Man will always have those 10 traits. So I think that's a really good point.
Another good point, that I think you just made was how the story of a game is different to each player because the interactive aspect of it. We are really playing the character in the story, and that sometimes means that the story of the game is different, and it's not we don't necessarily have the same storytelling experience with the same game. And and I think about a lot of the AAA titles, especially, it's a very immersive world, and the developers really take the time and energy to create these different scenarios that, based on the player's choices, can have different outcomes. So, for example, there's like this horror game Until Dawn where every character can end up living or dying. So you can have exponentially different endings to the story. So definitely for those types of game, I can see how it's difficult for it to be adapted into other genres like film or TV, where it's intrinsically more of a shared experience. But for games like The Last of Us, that's really heralded as one of the most memorable and moving and compelling video game stories of all time, it is more natural for those types of games to be adapted into a different format. And we're definitely excited to see more of those coming into the industry and reaching a wider audience. And and we kind of talked about a lot of these games where a story is central to the game itself. But when it comes to kind of these social network games, I don't think the storyline is the first thing that comes to mind when people think about it. So, and you, of course, have worked on such games for a long time. So, to you, do you see the importance of a central story or of a plot line important to these type of games? Do such social network games exist?
I think for social network games that rely on social mechanics a lot, having a story that's on rails is a lot less important, because sort of the point of a social network game and social games in general is to, as quickly as possible, get people in a place where they're creating stories as open-endedly as possible with other people. And so you might see a whole bunch of story like in the tutorial that sort of like gets people in. Here, maybe a better way to put this is like, when we think about like the most important metric that we look at in games, it's the retention curve. It's how many people stick around after 1 day, after 7 days, after 30 days, after 90 days, after a year. The early part of the retention curve, like days 1 through 7, is a lot more influenced by things like story, right? Like, do you have an art style that people love? Can you get them to do a thing where they feel invested? Like, as an example, pick an avatar that, they care about, or like, invest in building out a thing that they don't want to lose. And then, maybe like day 7 through day 30, like what we call like midterm retention, that's a lot more sort of influenced by like the game mechanics. Is the game fun? What do the systems look like? Do I feel like I'm learning something? But generally speaking, the single most important thing for like long-term retention, day 30 and beyond, is social experiences. Am I making friends in the game? How often do I interact with other people? And, by extension, am I finding fun experiences with other people? And so maybe that's like a very quantitative way to answer your questions. Like the story matters, but like, sort of very early on in the experience. And then sort of, the hope is that you get people into a place where, they're just playing with other people.
That makes a lot of sense. We're very quantitative people, so anytime you talk about metrics, we're all for it. You've brought up learning a couple times, and I think, and you were talking earlier about these different types of games, like making peace, being a good leader, and it's such an interesting concept about something we talk a lot about with entertainment and storytelling is the way it's built to educate, the way it's built to push society forward, and it's one of the biggest ways we have to teach and educate and grow. And I think one of the things we're seeing a lot with games right now, and I don't know how long this has been going on or if it's something I'm just noticing now, but we see a lot of games entering a lot of different fields right now. And I think fitness is probably the one that comes to mind right now through Oculus and through Meta. I know you worked at Meta for a long time, but do you see, is that something new that's happening where gaming's entering all these new different fields like education, mental health, fitness, and are you excited by that? What do you see the future in that realm?
This has actually been going on for a long time. Like not to maybe like wax academic, but like the reason people play games and like play is to learn. Tiger cubs wrestle with each other because they're learning to hunt. The reason our brains love playing games is because games make our brains feel like they're getting better at a thing. Literally, human beings are wired to play games, and they use games to learn. And so, well, what does that mean? That means games by nature, by evolution, are a really great way to get people to change their behavior, either by augmenting it or by changing it completely. And so we've seen games be really effective tools to teach people things or to get them to do other things for a really long time, right? Like, think about the top education apps in the world, like Duolingo, as an example, is based around game rules. Like if you go into it, you have achievements and you have levels and you have challenges and all of these things. Why? It's because like games are a really great way to like, get people to act in a certain way. you think about like what are the most effective ways to get people to like overcome physical inertia and like go work out, like leaderboards, right? Or like reciprocity, like all of these things that come from sort of like game concepts have been in and around the rest of the world forever, because people have sort of stumbled on, maybe they didn't think about the academic reason why, but it's just like it's an intuitive thing to understand that like people love games. Or like my favorite game as like a child was not a video game, it was like the McDonald's sweepstakes for Monopoly. Like that's also a game, and that also got us to buy way more burgers than we probably would have as a family otherwise. Like, and so anyway, this is again a long-winded way of saying like everybody is a gamer. We're literally wired as human beings to like be gamers and play games. And so that's why you see it as such an effective way to like influence behavior and so many other things. And so when you say like, oh, games are starting to like, bleed into all this other stuff, it's always been there. And I'm actually really excited to see, maybe more, maybe it happen in a more structured way.
Yeah, that was such an amazing answer to a question I kind of fumbled. But it was such an amazing answer because I feel like the way you're talking sounds a lot like the way we talk about storytelling, because it's something where it's like once you start looking for it, you kind of see it everywhere. Once you start looking for something specific, you're like, oh, that's storytelling. Oh, that's a game. And I'm thinking about what you're saying about like the gamification of things. And I think about the learning games I played in school, but not only just that, like I think about these fitness classes where it's done very gamified with leaderboards and with point system, like 500 right. And I think about the way gamification bleeds into certain things and the way how addictive that is and how it can be really used for good. And I think about some of these fitness games like Supernatural, Beat Saber, things like that. And I think about how some of them aren't obviously games, but if you use that gamification mindset, it's such an interesting way for us as humans to grow and learn. I wanted to pivot a little bit into your role at a16z and about going into this realm where instead of being a builder, now you are kind of you are helping fund new games and learning about new innovations and things like that. When you're in one of these pitch meetings and someone's coming to you for funding, for support for their brand new game, obviously storytelling is such a huge part of that because very often they're trying to bring you into their world. They're trying to sell you on a vision when they don't have a lot of things done. So can you tell me a little bit about what are some of the differentiating factors between a gamer and a visionary entrepreneur, and what are the things you look for in these pitches?
I think that there is no, I think, universal answer, because I think like, amazing companies can be built with such different starting theses. And in fact, we actually talked about this a lot at the firm, is like, if you go back and look at the most successful game companies in the world and like their original pitches for a game, very few of them actually ended up executing the game that they really wanted to build from the start. This is like a natural thing in startups, but especially in games where like, you'll build a thing and like sometimes you'll figure out that the thing that you really wanted is actually kind of impossible, or actually it feels really clunky when you put sort of like code to paper instead of like a paper prototype. Or maybe like in the course of building a thing, user preferences changed. A competitor came out and like did the thing that you want to do really well. And so you should actually go do another thing that's like, you can actually, be the best in the world at. So when we think about funding a company, we try to be a little bit flexible on the game idea, knowing that it will change. And we talk a lot about a founder's ability to execute and to tell stories. And the storytelling part is important for a couple of reasons. One is the pitch they're giving us is the same pitch they're giving to their employees. And so it helps your ability to recruit if you can tell a good story. And by the way, not just like weave a good story, like tell a story that makes people feel something, that makes sense, that is aspirational and inspirational, that like, builds on something. You have the empathy as a storyteller to like build on something that like somebody else might really care about, to sort of like, modulate your story depending on the audience. Like all of these things are important in our founders. And the reality is like when you're investing in something really early, you're investing in what you believe is the founder's ability to execute, move fast, and also tell the story to employees, to future investors, to the rest of the world, to potential players. And so storytelling does end up playing, a big role in how we think about pitches.
To close out every one of our episodes, we have this segment called Suspenders. It works like this. We ask you a random fun question that's not related to anything whatsoever, and you can give us any random answer you feel like. The question of the day is, what food do you have a love-hate relationship with?
Oh, this would probably be ramen. Japanese, like a giant ramen bowl. And the reason it's a love-hate, I think love is maybe obvious. The hate part of it is because ramen, I have a really hard time eating ramen like every day. So like pho, I could probably eat every day. Ramen, I can't. It's like a little too rich, but like I want to. And so, there's like this constant battle where, I would go out and get a great bowl of ramen if I could all of the time, but I can't.
I feel that.
Absolutely. I feel the same way. For my answer to this would be Oreos or the trolley sour gummy worms, because I can't just have one. And you can't buy them individually, really. So you buy a box, and that's, I ate half in an hour. So, absolutely, I totally understand what you're coming from. Welcome to Top Hat. This is the part of the episode where we dissect and analyze some of the key learnings we got from this week's expert storyteller. And this week we had a really cool one. Kev, how awesome was it to finally crack into a topic you've been wanting to talk about forever, gaming?
I know. We're so happy to have Josh on the show, to talk all about video games and gaming as a storytelling medium, and there's so much to unpack out of that. And I think one of the most important thing about video games as a unique storytelling medium is how interactive and immersive it can be, and that it can be different for every player. And why that's different is, if you think about a book or a film or a TV show, the story is there, it's set and done, it's the same, and different people can watch the same show and experience the same story and have that find that kind of connection with each other. And that's simple. But with a lot of video games, it's different, because everyone can play through a video game in a different style, and sometimes games allow you to make different choices throughout the story so that you can have different endings to the story. So for you and I, if the two of us play the same game, but we make different choices because we have different values or preferences, for the same game, we might end up having a different story. We create a different story for ourselves. So even if it's just the same video game, you and I might have a very different experience and very different takeaways out of it. So that's something very cool about gaming as a storytelling medium, is we are creators of the story.
Gaming is such a diverse medium, right? It's not one thing. Everyone experiences gaming in different ways, whether it's through your favorite meditation app that gives you credit for how many days you meditate, through Duolingo that gamifies the idea of learning a language, where it's like, 5 stars for this or points for this, through even social media with likes, follows, things like that. Everyone interacts with this gamification of life because there's something about our brains and some of the way we communicate. There's a really deep story there where the gamification story works with us. The story of achieving something, the story of you're the hero who's starting this language journey on Duolingo, and every time you achieve something, you get the points. Like, that's all storytelling. So gaming is such an interesting field, because whether or not you are a huge fan of Dungeons and Dragons or Call of Duty or Fortnite doesn't mean you are not affected by gaming, because the gamification of everything is a huge part of the way we interact with our phones. Anytime you're on a leaderboard at Berries or at Spin Class, or anytime you get an achievement for learning a new language 5 times a week, that is gaming. And it's so important to see the stories behind that, to see how that's affecting you, whether that's a healthy thing or an unhealthy thing. For example, for me, I have a lot of problems with social comparison. So I don't use social media. I don't like Instagram. It doesn't work for me. That would be a negative gamification. So I think that's a huge learning for me from this conversation, is to think about gaming a little bit more expansively and think about how it affects our day-to-day lives and how it is in so many different things we use.
Yeah, I mean, that is why gamification has been such a buzzword, the past few years. Because if you think about the process of playing games, it is a hero's journey. You learn the mechanisms, you acquire the skills, you apply the skills to solve the obstacle, and you get a reward. So, that's an immensely satisfying process as a player, and there's a, very fulfilling story that you create. And then, another really interesting perspective that Josh has pointed out to us is that, particularly with social media games, it is actually a storytelling process because, it's a useful tool of human interaction or social interactions, because over the years, that's a memory that you can fondly look back to, that you did this thing together. So social media gaming is an important medium for storytelling, even though people don't realize it often. And this has been another great episode of the Linen Suit and Plastic Tie podcast. If you like our content, make sure to subscribe wherever you listen. Leave us a comment or review to let us know what you're thinking. Follow us on Instagram or TikTok at LSPTpod, and LinkedIn, Linen Suit and Plastic Tie.
You took some time today to become a better storyteller. That's amazing. You are doing great. See you next time.